Everyone. This is chapter one, a model of compensation, where we're going to go through what I call the pay model, and our book calls the compensation model. I've made chapter one into two different videos. What I would suggest you do is either print out these slides and write notes on the slides, because I'm going to only put bullet points on the slides, but go through them in a little more detail. Or you can also just write notes without having the slides in front of you, just watching the screen. Again, it's a video, so you can stop and start whenever you want. I'm aware I sometimes talk quickly, so that might actually be helpful for you to start and stop. I'm also putting these up in YouTube, so YouTube should be able to do closed captioning, in which case you should be able to see the words printed on the screen. Sometimes for me, that's more helpful in writing notes. So if you find that helpful, feel free to turn on the closed captioning. So what is compensation when we talk about compensation in this class? I often might use the term total rewards when I'm talking about it in this class, and that's the human resource management term for what we call compensation in this class generally. And compensation includes two different kinds of compensation that we'll talk about through the semester. The one that we'll talk the most about is what we call direct compensation, and this is salary and wages. So this is kind of the tangible money or cash that people get for the work that they do. The other part of total compensation is indirect compensation or benefits. And so this includes tangible and intangible parts of compensation, such as health insurance, retirement benefits. It could include things like having paid leave, like paid parental leave, paid sick leave, that sort of thing. But total rewards is both a direct and indirect compensation. And we can think of compensation as an employment contract between an employer and an employee. It's a cost for the employer to hire the employee to do the work they need to do in their organization. But for the employee, there's a reward if they're able to do the work that the employer needs done within that organization. So what kinds of things do employers and employees bring to this contract? For employers, they're giving money to employees and benefits, so that's the direct and indirect compensation. They might also give other non-financial rewards, such as, Employee of the Month or a special title and that sort of thing. Employers often provide training, especially to new hires, but also as people transition from one job to another, or as things change within the workplace, especially with changes in technology or the way that the industry is working. You also get often some career development, which could include training, but it could be something beyond training, such as getting extra degrees. I know in the College of Business, we have a lot of professional MBAs whose organizations are paying for them to get a Master's of Business Administration. And then a lot of employers provide coaching and mentoring for employees to develop skills or to improve on skills that maybe they're weaker on. Employees, on the other hand, bring their knowledge, skills, and abilities to the job. So you often will be hired, or you'll hire employees because they have a specific knowledge or skill set that you need for a specific kind of job. But we also expect employees to do certain kinds of behaviors, like show up regularly or on time to work. We need them to carry out their tasks dependably. So if a supervisor asks an employee to do something, the employee will get that done in a timely manner. They expect employees to cooperate with others, especially because a lot of us will be working in places where teamwork is required to get the job done. And then a lot of employers expect employees to make useful suggestions to improve the work environment, to make the organization more productive, to really get the perspective of employees to improve the processes within that organization. But compensation is significant for everyone for different reasons. For employees, for most of us, it's the primary reason we work. We need the money or we need the benefits in order to have our livelihoods, to support our families, to support the lifestyle that we want to have. And then for some employees, and probably most of us, honestly, work also provides some status to us. And you can think about this in two different ways. In one way, in our society, when you don't have a job, you're considered unemployed, and there is definitely a stigma to being unemployed. And in fact, in management, there's lots of people who research this kind of stigma and how difficult it can be, for example, for people who are unemployed to get a job because they might have gaps in their resume, or people are criticizing them for taking unemployment even though they paid into the system, and that sort of thing. Another way that you can think about status is in terms of the hierarchy within an organization or even across organizations. So that some people, like who are entry level, for example, may not have a lot of status in their organization or in their industry, but as they move up into leadership positions, either within their organization or throughout their careers, they're gaining status with their peers, but also with other leaders, managers, and supervisors as well. For organizations, compensation is often their biggest expenditure. The textbook talks about it's between 20 and 80%. For a lot of the organizations that you'll work in, especially ones that provide services, that total will be closer to that 80%, where it's the biggest expenditure and it's a huge chunk of the amount of money. Industries where you produce products so that you're putting more money into capital like buildings or technology or equipment or products to sell, you might have compensation might be a smaller part of the total budget because you're also paying for all of that capital. Organizations also use it, and this is a big chunk of our class this semester, to attract, engage, and retain their employees, is essentially a tool for motivation. And then for the US economy overall, because this is an economics textbook, this is actually 60% of our gross national product is in compensation to employees. And this is actually increasing in the sense that our economy is becoming more and more service-based. We're less likely to produce goods. So this is something that becomes more and more important for the US economy as well over the years. But it's also a multidisciplinary concept. And I really like this text for bringing this up because a lot of times when we have human resource management textbooks, they just kind of focus on the psychological perspective and sometimes the sociological perspective, but forget that there are other perspectives that influence how we think about compensation in organizations. From an economic perspective, compensation is the price that organizations pay for labor services from the employees. And you will see this sometimes, and probably even in this textbook later in the book, as being called human capital. Human capital simply means the employees that work within an organization and do the work that the organization needs them to do. A lot of what I'll be talking about in this class, because this is the perspective I come from, I have a background in psychology, is the psychological perspective, and that's that contract between an individual and an organization. We use compensation to motivate individual behavior in organizations, and that's why we have different kinds of compensation. And then we pay people different amounts of compensation depending on their performance, depending on where they're at in the organizational hierarchy. We have lots of things that influence that amount. We often, though, act as though employees only work for money, and that's kind of what a compensation class will focus on. But I want you to always remember, for a lot of employees, money may be the most important, but it's not the primary reason, or it's not the only reason they work. And it may not be later in their careers, especially when you're making a certain amount of money. It may not even be the primary reason you work anymore. So there are many other things that motivate employees, not only the status of, say, their job role, but also the fact that they get to work with good people that they really enjoy working with. They have challenging work. They get to learn new things. There's lots of things that motivate people other than just compensation. And so we have these other rewards that operate at work that aren't related to compensation that we should consider when we're thinking about our compensation system. In terms of the sociological perspective, this is different from the psychological perspective, which really focuses on the individual. Sociology looks at institutions, organizations, structures within the society. So this is where the status symbol part comes into play. That we have an idea when someone tells us what their job title is, we have an idea of how much status they might have in their organization. And then most of us have some kind of hierarchy in our head of people based on their job roles, what their status should be in society. So such that usually compensation is nearly directly related to the status we give people in society. So the more you get paid, the more status you often have in society for the work that you do and the compensation that you earn. Organizations also have these hierarchies, and those are often also based on pay. In fact, we would say that best practices is they should be based on pay. If you're an entry-level employee, you should not be paid more than your supervisor, for example. But small differences in pay, even with employees in the same job role, can have great perceived significance for those employees or for others in the organization or outside of the organization who know about the small differences. So pay transparency really matters, and people will interpret those small pay differences or any pay difference in lots of ways, especially if they don't have the information about why there might be a pay difference. And then there's a symbolic significance to the methods of payment that we use. We're not going to get into it too much in this class, but sometimes in compensation classes, we'll talk about CEO compensation, for example. A s the more you are paid in stock, for example, or equity within the company, usually the more status you have in that company, the more power you have in that company. Sometimes there are employee-owned organizations where you will get some stock, but it's not the same as having, equity within a significant chunk of your compensation being equity within the organization. And also, there's a difference in frequency of payments. It seems, and this isn't true in every organization or even across every industry, people who are paid lower wages or who have lower status in their organization, like entry-level employees, are more likely to be paid more often than people who are higher status in the organization. So you can think about if you've ever worked in a place that had hourly workers versus salaried workers. The hourly workers might get paid every week or every other week, but the salaried workers might only get paid every other week or every month, for example. And then a huge chunk of what we'll talk about throughout the class is that there's a market influence on pay as well that determines what pay is. It's not just that organizational hierarchy, but it's also outside of the organization, how other people are paying these jobs. The political perspective looks at the power and influence that pay has. It can motivate people to do what you want them to do within an organization, for example. We also can think of it as people with more money or who make more money in an organization often have more power and influence within that organization as well. We also have political influence from the organizations themselves, unions, which this book does a really good job of mentioning that, even though sometimes we don't always emphasize that in compensation courses. Different groups of people and employees all can try to influence pay in very different ways. Finally, we have some really important perspectives that we need to think about in terms of compensation as well. And this is how we are always kind of making decisions about how we're going to pay people within an organization. One equity concept that I'm hoping you've seen before is what we call distributive justice. And this distributive means the distribution of compensation within the organization. So returns, what the employee makes, should be proportionate to what they contribute to the organization. And usually, like the way I think about it in my head is like the scale on this PowerPoint, where employees have certain kinds of inputs, and then compensation is the outputs from the organization for those employee inputs. There's also communications concept, and this is something we'll probably talk more about as the semester goes on. Information availability through the internet has made pay transparency even more important because it can influence what employees know about their pay, what they know about other people's pay, and then it can influence the way that they perceive their own pay, but also what they do about their pay if they think it's too low, for example. Information often has an inflationary effect on wages, though. A really good example of this that I'm sure many of you have seen is that CEO compensation for publicly traded companies is reported to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. This is the U.S. Government body that kind of oversees the way that organizations run in terms of their financials. And they have a lot of rules ever since kind of the collapse of Enron in the early 2000s around disclosure of pay within organizations. Well, because CEOs can see each other's pay, they can use that for negotiations to keep getting more and more pay. And so we see CEO pay going up faster and faster than employee pay, where employee pay doesn't have that kind of disclosure. A lot of companies haven't always disclosed it until recently, either because they believe in pay transparency or because the law has required that they are at least somewhat transparent with their pay. And so the more information that people have, the higher the wages will usually go. So our book shows this kind of graphic where all of these compensation concepts are influencing pay within the organization. We'll focus on some of these more than others, especially the equity part, the psychological part, and a little bit of the sociological part. But I don't want you to forget that there's, especially for example, when we get to laws and regulations, that politics and economics also has a really important part to play in compensation, even if that's not always kind of the crux of what we're going to talk about in this class. So just to remind you of the key stakeholders that are in compensation that we always have to be aware of, we have the organizations that are employing people, we have employee groups. Our book likes to break down the employee groups into things like production, clerical, sales. We won't do that as much in this class, but some compensation classes do that because different kinds of employee groups get paid in different ways. You probably already know this to some extent because you know, for example, that in sales, you might be compensated by how much you sell. versus other employees who are clerical, for example, where they're not selling something, so they usually get some kind of base wages to begin with. But pay determinants, so what we think is important and what people are paid, may be different for different groups. So if you're clerical, for example, what's important for you is to be able to work with other people and support the work that they're doing. So you might have administrative skills that are really important, such as keeping things organized, communicating to other employees, that sort of thing, versus like a supervisor who may have to do some of the same tasks, but what might be more important in their for their pay is their decision-making abilities, their abilities to collect information, to communicate with their employees around different issues in a very diplomatic way, for example. And so there might be different pay between supervisors and clerical staff because different things are important in the jobs that they do. Unions also influence pay, not only for those who are in the union, but when you have organizations where some employees are unionized, the unions will actually influence the pay of non-unionized employees as well. So that's something organizations have to keep aware of. We'll actually have an entire chapter on government and regulatory bodies and the kinds of laws that we have to think about when we're thinking about direct and indirect compensation. And then the public also has a stake in compensation, but often the public doesn't really get a chance to have a stake in direct compensation for employees, for example, so how much people are getting paid. But it is something that we talk about in the media, for example. Politicians will often run on increasing minimum wage, for example. So the public has some influence, but it's more indirect than it is direct on people's pay. So what are employers paying for? And this is actually, if you go to the syllabus for our class, you'll see there are some weeks where, for example, in I think it's week 8, we do individual wages versus week 9, for example, where we have performance-based pay. Some of these are based on the job, but some of them are based on how someone performs their job. So the traditional way of paying people or the traditional focus of compensation has been the job or the role. So you have a job description. You apply for that job and you get that job and then you fulfill the tasks that are part of that job description and that is how you get paid. But a lot of organizations are turning to what we call more person-based pay or more individual-based pay, where it's really about the knowledge, skills, and abilities you bring to the job. So you may have knowledge, skills, and abilities that go beyond the tasks that are in your job role. You may also have competencies that you've developed or you are developing while you're in a job role that allows you to do more than what you were originally hired to do. And that's actually very valuable for organizations. So a lot of organizations are now doing things like competency-based pay. So instead of what is your job role, what competencies do you bring that allow the organization to use you more flexibly across different kinds of job roles or tasks in a job. And then a lot of us will also be in organizations that have outcome or performance-based pay, such as merit pay, where you're based on your performance, which is usually like job evaluations or some other kind of result that may be like your sales, for example, that you're actually getting paid based on that performance. These are not exclusive in the sense that you can mix these. So you often will have performance-based pay with job or person-based pay, but they're different ways of thinking about how we compensate employees.